The invention of Muslim psychology, the new Muslim enterprise at the cost of your mental health. So what I want to do is briefly speak in about a matter of 15 minutes, a growing trend that I've seen with the growing use and rise of this idea of Muslim psychology in Western society. And so I'm going to do a brief intro. I'm going to discuss a phenomenon that my observations have led me to see. I'm going to actually speak to the merit and history of Islamic psychology and what I see happening in the modern area and how it really conflicts with psychology and Islam and does the opposite of real therapy and could be the countering of actually being Islamic. So I hope you enjoy this. But so have you ever experienced a period of depression, anxiety, or another mental episode? I'm sure that you have. And experiencing these ordeals can be traumatizing and change the quality of life for you and your family. Now, have you thought of speaking to someone, maybe a friend, a parent, a sibling, or a professional? Let me ask you, how would you choose a professional? How do you choose a professional when it comes to most things in life? Do you review their qualifications? Maybe you do. Do you review your budget and the accessibility to that professional? That's probably a very likely uh, selection criteria. Now, there's so many factors that you would consider when, you know, choosing a professional, an accountant, a mechanic, and maybe one of those is, does this person belong to my kin and community? And that's plausible. But when it comes to serious things or general things, do you consider that this person's not Arabic or not Muslim? If you went to your family physician and he recommended a surgeon that wasn't Muslim or wasn't Arabic, would you say, no, I wouldn't want to do that? I would think certainly not. However, today we actually do see this exact phenomenon occurring. More and more, we see the rise of a Muslim therapist culture where we are commercializing a new brand of psychotherapy that comes in many different ways, brand names such as Muslim psychotherapy or Muslim psychology. Um, and I hope to expand on this phenomenon and speak to it, and hopefully you find it of value. Now, how did this all start? So I'm going quite a bit back, but from the research I did, there is some items in the Quran and researched items from early Islamic thinkers and scholars that these certain concepts in Islam parallel certain modern psychological concepts. So, for instance, the idea of an upper nafs and a lower nafs. So, like an idea of the ego and the superego and the id that existed, um, in the Quran and even previous to the Quran, these concepts have existed in other cultures. There's also a concept early on about the soul and how it's connected to the heart, which is how it's connected to the mind. And this is kind of, you know, speaking to an early idea, an early form of, mental health integration with the body. Now, none of those things actually reveal deep research or science. And so early Islamic scholars actually saw the um, deeper learning when they were exposed to Greek thinkers and Greek writings, which were not Islamic. And I don't think they were monotheistic. So we see that happen when the early Muslim scholars actually first encounter Greek writings and actually learn that there is a place for approaching psychological illness in a scientific manner, as opposed to using Quranic ayats and very basic level ruqya on what are very complicated illnesses. So, in terms of history, it is a very interesting history because we do see that the history of Islamic scholarship in psychology or mental health kind of parallels the golden age period where they really expand early on in their rise and get exposure to other ideas and other nations, in particular with the Greeks, which the Muslim Arabs are fascinated with. And one of the early people to kind of really embark on this was Ibn Sina. And in the early 9th century, Ibn Sina actually was so influenced by Greek philosophers that he adapted their concepts to fit the Islamic doctrine, not the other way around. So if you understand what I'm saying here, he didn't try to do what we're doing in the modern sense and take Islamic concepts and merge them into modern science. He actually did it the other way around, which is he found great information and observations in Greek sciences and made them more palatable to the Muslim sense. So that's the first thing that I found quite interesting. That, he really took most of his ideas, and the ideas were actually quite profound and powerful. And if we take a look at some of these ideas, you'll see that, Ibn Sina was actually really able to understand very early on the concept of senses, especially inner senses, and other outer senses of humans and animals, and how that equates to a common sense, which we use to collate information, or how we use external senses, and we use things, and we have these senses of attentive imagination and the ability to recollect and have memory and imagination of animals and so on and so forth. So these are some pretty profound concepts that he took from Greek sources and incorporated into Islamic sciences, which actually does provide some evidence that the Muslims of the early time were actually more engaging with the modern science of their time. Now, if you were to actually evaluate how medicine took place in that early 9th century period, you see that soothsaying and ruqya is actually looked at as quite a village doctor type of trade and practice. Even at that time, the golden age of Cairo and Baghdad, there were hospitals with surgeons and doctors and who actually used the most sophisticated forms of therapy that they had available, which included shock therapy and music therapy to treat mental illnesses. So it's actually a misnomer to think that we have always relied on some form of, deep, nafs hardening, ruqya practicing medicine. Now, the next major figurehead we see that is quite revered, especially by the Sufis, is Al-Ghazali. And this guy was a scholar. And I don't think Al-Ghazali or Ibn Sina ever regarded themselves as Muslim scholars or Islamic scholars in particular. I think they saw themselves as scientists and scholars and general scholars in particular. But he goes a little bit deeper and takes a little bit more of a pragmatic approach, which is kind of interesting because he has a Sufi. So when you think about Sufis, you might not think that these folks are the most pragmatic in approach, but he produces a book called the Ilia, where he actually, if you read it, observes children, and he finds that there's a lot of parallels with children in his observation and children in the Freudian observation. And so what he sees is that children are generally egocentric. They make their decisions without consideration for others. And, fear is actually learned through conditioning or negative experiences. These are all very Freudian, Pavlovian concepts that we see much, much later in the 20th century. But he makes those observations quite early. And those are not Quranic observations. So it does show you that the early scholars were actually quite scientific in their approach to, these types of subjects. And it goes further than that. We see that um, we see that the idea of Islamic psychotherapy or approach towards, mental health doesn't really exist. You have scholars who are incidentally Muslim, who are using all textbooks, all available sciences to create books for people who belong to their community to integrate it into their life, not the other way around, where they're exporting their, soothsayer ruqya culture to modern evolved cultures and societies to incorporate in their life, because you don't actually see that. You don't see that kind of exchange happening. You don't see the Greeks or the Europeans take, the art form of ruqya and implement it into their antiquity. But we do take their, research and observations in hard sciences and integrate it into our community. So, it is a very interesting thing that we were able to do that in the 9th and 10th century. But today we see the opposite phenomenon happening. Now, I don't want to be totally negative. There are some merits to what people would consider Islamic psychotherapy. I think there is a place where the novelty of seeking therapy from a person of your culture, religion, language provides some comfort and relief. However, it is also kind of a dual-edged sword that if you live in a Muslim-only society, well, then there's no such thing as a Muslim therapist. They're just therapists because you're all of the same common religion, language, and culture. So the element of needing a Muslim therapist there does not exist because you're all therapists. So that's one thing that you have to kind of accept. Now, if you live in a multicultural society, and Islam does recommend, if you live in a multicultural society, to act a part of that culture and society, not to differentiate and kind of pull yourself and remove yourself from the normal mosaic of society. And if you do live in that society and you need to have a Muslim person to help you with a serious mental illness, you have to ask yourself, well, is that really a serious mental illness, or is that a crisis of faith? Because if a crisis of faith, then yeah, perhaps you do need a Muslim therapist that has the training and art to improve your crisis of faith, or work on your your heart and your lower nafs and upper nafs. Maybe there is that space. But if you do suffer from a real mental illness and you're going to a family doctor and you're on pharmacogenics and you're getting all these types of things, it would behoove you to actually get a referral to the best person qualified in that space, because there is nothing unique, ni Muslim, to a Muslim person's mental illness. I mean, that is such a misdirection and marketing scheme. I mean, I've heard this stuff since post 9/11 that Muslims are very strange, very different, very weird. They're actually not. They're products of Western society just as much as anyone else. And post-industrialized world, they have the same issues just like everyone else. And so actually the limiting factor might be a Muslim therapist who only sees Muslim patients. They might not actually have a worldly view and might lack the empathy that you need. So I think there's a merit when it comes to actually, seeing people for improvement of the nafs and the soul, but certainly not in a general sense to work on the actual core mental issues. And what about today, like in the modern era? And this is kind of one of the most important things that I would like to speak about, is that in the modern sense, we see that there is a general rise in mental health issues all over the world, not just in the West or in the industrialized world, certainly in the Islamic world. And we have a far better understanding of the mind, the body. We have a far better understanding of pharmacogenics and therapies, and we have them available to pretty much all sorts of people. Now, I actually am not ignorant that there are parallels that we see from therapies like DBT and CBT and so forth, where those types of therapies have parallels in Islamic tradition or prophetic tradition. There is wisdom in it. There's certain wisdom in prophetic tradition, but I see wisdom in also Jewish tradition and Hindu tradition and Buddhist tradition. And true scholarship takes that wisdom and makes it more palatable for your community. Now, if in the modern sense we are not able to take the best of today's modern available resources in the form of therapy and make it palatable for our own people. And instead, we revert our own people to very narrow, limited therapies, underdeveloped therapies from early 9th and 10th century Muslim world. That would actually be quite a disservice to people that actually have serious mental health issues. And it's kind of ridiculous, right? That you're going to use untrialed and untested Islamic psychotherapy or psychology to treat serious mental illnesses. I mean, when you see a physician, you probably need to be referred to a specialist that is the best in its trade, once again. And if you start basing all your referrals on the Muslimness or the Islamicness, then you have to start judging people's character. So now when you see a Muslim or an Islamic psychologist, they better look and talk and act like a Muslim, right? Big beard, big abaya, big hijab. You both got to be praying. It becomes an issue of definitions. Like, well, you're not Muslim enough, and your issues are actually that you're not praying enough. That's why you have these mental health issues, and eventually it'll go back to that soothsayer ruqya culture because you've neglected to go to a very applied science approach. Now, I do think that we have to give credit to modern psychology because the golden age in Muslim thinking and scholarship ended in the 10th century. And we're now in 2020. Over 1,000 years have gone by. The world has evolved and done a lot more research and development than the golden age ever did. And we can't ignore that. We have to give credit where it's due. And it should be our duty to make this subject more palatable to an ignorant population. It should not be an issue of self-esteem that we have to somehow inject our concepts that are pretty untrialed and pretty untested and pretty underdeveloped. And so I think the more and more people are misled and misdirected, they will actually complicate the lives of a lot of people. And you probably will take years away from actual treatment and potentially, take them to a point of no recovery. Now, where does this actually become a problem, or where is this actually a conflict? Well, I described to you earlier that you wouldn't go to a physician to ask for a referral to a Muslim-only surgeon. I mean, if you did, you really probably have an issue, and it probably has to do with how you see the world and how you see other people, and probably your own self-esteem. So that's a different issue. The actual conflict, though, is that when people are talking about Islamic psychology and Islamic therapy, there's actually no basis for it. Like, even if I were to say, yes, I accept this, please show me the evidence, and you start going through the evidence, they have very limited scholarship. They have very limited work on the subject. Even postmodern writings on it, all they can speak to is like, here's this chart of the upper nafs and the lower nafs, and that's all we can kind of speak to, and we can speak to this, exploration that Ghazali made and, Ibn Sina made on how to, control the lower nafs and the upper nafs, and that's about it. And how do you do that? Well, you do that through prayer, avoiding sin, and performing certain rituals. And that's all great, but it's very Muslim-centric, Muslim context. And if you're not a very religious Muslim or practicing Muslim, it won't work. If you're not a very faithful person, it won't work. And if you're not Muslim, it won't work. So it's not exactly a universal therapy. And not to mention that God also, the Quran also describes that, the cure, or science itself, or cures, are out in the universe. We should be looking at all sorts of services out there. Now, the obvious thing that I think is happening here is that, just like what you saw with halal mortgages and how that was a bit of a marketing ploy to create a market space for Muslim mortgages, we're seeing the same thing happen here. We see, unemployed social workers or psychologists who are trying to invent the field of Muslim psychology, which, to be honest, is not even in its infancy. There's no research. It's not even credible enough to be a profession or regulated as a health care profession. For the most part, social workers, psychologists will have to rely on their secular, quasi-medical training. They probably can only revert to Muslim principles in mental health during the initial intake interview with you. But after that, they're probably going to have to revert to their actual training in mental health. Now, what's the big deal? Why am I, creating such a stir? Well, the big deal is if you know why this is something worthy of thinking about. If you have a loved person or a friend or a parent or a child that's going through mental illness, and although you may want to take a noble Islamic route, you might actually improve your religiosity, and you might pray more. It might look good to your parents, and it might look good to other people. It might make you more acceptable to other Muslims, which I think might help your self-esteem. But that's super superficial. If you actually have deep issues, you're probably not going to be managing the trauma or the pain. And for the most part, we're a pretty unevolved culture. We do, live in the world of superficiality. And so, we look superficially happy and superficially healthy, but deep inside, we have huge issues. We are a product of the post-industrial world. We have abuse, we have drug abuse, we have alcohol issues, we have divorce, we have, kids running away, we have all sorts of very real problems that, Islamic psychology, nafs managing, whatever you want to call it, won't cure. They have no evidence to cure that kind of stuff. This is highly traumatic stuff that you actually need to use a combination of, really evidence-based therapies and likely pharmacogenics. Now, the other issue that comes into this is that when you start seeing Muslim psychologists and you're Muslim, there will be an element of judgment because that's the whole basis of this. That when you look at the nafs and we're saying that we have problems, well, we're actually saying we have problems with the lower nafs. We're probably engaged in bad things. And we're not doing enough good things. So you create an element of judgment, which is probably not the best type of relationship between a therapist and his, his patient. And so we create this element, which I think is a very unhealthy item. And you also create a culture of quick resolution, because when you use an unevolved science, you can't do much. Like, you will run out of steam. There's only so many prayers in a day you can perform. There's only so many umrahs and hajjs you can perform. You run out of steam, and it becomes quite schizophrenic, actually, like the overzealous person. And we see them all the time. People who've experienced trauma, and all they're taught is just to become overzealous Muslims, and it doesn't really do anything. It backfires in a couple of years, and there's total burnout. And most often, these people actually leave Islam altogether. And so that's a problem because, I've seen it. I've heard people, being told to, get remarried within 40 days of a divorce or to move on real quick. And they have barely scratched the surface of the pain and the trauma, and they're being pushed out the door. And although that might seem like, prophetic wisdom, or it might sound like, oh yeah, this is what our culture does. Well, as I mentioned, that's not really science, and that's not psychological in nature. That's actually, you're reverting back to a soothsayer, Rukia style culture. And that's the danger, that as hard as you try to be a professional, you'll always revert back to that tendency. Now, I actually think the entire approach to Islamic psychology is not Islamic at all, and they should not be in the same sentence. As I said before, it's a total marketing scam, and it's just as bad as when you see people using the term halal mortgages or halal pig fat and so on and so forth. Now, this is probably a way to reinvent a Muslim economy, which might not be totally bad because, Muslim countries probably need to develop a Muslim economy. And so, really, banking in Muslim countries doesn't need to be referred to as Islamic banking. It could just be banking. And, psychology in Muslim countries probably doesn't have to be referred to as Muslim psychology. It can just be called psychology. But the actual non-Islamicness is that when you take a look at the early Islamic scholars, they didn't actually argue for a Muslim or Islamic approach to mental health. And if you look at the modern Islamic psychologists or Islamic researchers, they haven't produced any credible research papers in Islamic psychology that are of any merit and would not be, published in the American Journal of Psychology. So that's a big thing, that the modern leading scientific community has not accepted you, and that's a big thing. So medical schools, no one is going to actually, you know, at least now they haven't accepted Islamic psychotherapy and psychology as a real viable form of therapy. I mean, they might say, yeah, it's helpful for this population group because they're nervous nannies to hang out with Muslims, but certainly nothing to that therapy. And there's nothing, at the PhD level being researched or circulated. And so it's a very infant-like subject. And now that's not a totally bad thing. Maybe it does deserve, the next 1,000 years of research, because that's what the modern world has done. Post 10th century, post Dark Ages, Europe has been spending the last 1,000 years in researching and testing, different types of therapies. So right now, it's totally not Islamic. Islamic psychology does not exist. There's no such thing. And the danger, once again, is that because it's in its infancy, just like how Freudian psychology is in its infancy, you become a guinea pig. You become a guinea pig, you go to people with real conditions, and you become a guinea pig to their trial and testing and experimentation. While they get the experience, you get, more trauma. And so this is probably not the best thing for you. And this is why we see a crossover of really unregulated people trying this out. We see imams, scholars calling themselves Islamic counselors, Islamic therapists. We're here to help bridge your faith, or, crisis of faith. Like, no, the guy doesn't have a crisis of faith. He has a serious, traumatic episode, a serious divorce matter. It's not a crisis of faith. But they do that all the time to A, protect themselves, but also B, to find a way into your, space to earn some money. Of course, this is usually an economic thing, a way of making a living, but primarily because Muslims right now are trying to make specialized spaces for their trade and craft. Frankly speaking, they have been pretty underwhelming in terms of actually producing any modern sciences. And so therefore they don't really have any claim to any modern profession. And so I kind of feel like what's happening right now is this rise of pretty unregulated, uncredible people who are now calling themselves Muslim counselors, which in actuality they're all soothsayers or very basic rudimentary thinking. Now, what can I conclude? Well, I don't want to insult the people that are actually looking at Muslim psychology as a career. I want to advise people that it's actually not psychology, it's not therapy, it's a perspective on how to look at mental health, the soul, the heart, the mind. And that's exactly what, Ibn Sina and al-Ghazali actually concluded. So if modern therapists revert back to Ibn Sina and al-Ghazali as their early pioneers, well, then you have to accept, what they wrote. And golden era scholars actually saw the subject they were actually reviewing, and were actually influenced primarily by modern thinkers, or early medieval thinkers, or early ancient world thinkers there from the Greeks, and took that in to make it more palatable for their own community. And they didn't see themselves as Islamic scholars; they simply saw themselves as scholars. So scholarship should always look at themselves as scholarship and not try to put a faith-based connection to it, because you make it unapproachable for people who don't belong to that community or faith. You make it even unapproachable for people who belong to that faith and culture based on the fear of judgment. And so that's a big problem. Now, what I want to tell people is the answer is in the first page of the Quran. It's actually, in my opinion, the answer to most of these types of issues, which is, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. God is the master of the universe. And I've always seen that says a lot in a simple line, that we don't live in a unique Muslim space or Muslim world. That is not the case. You actually live in the modern universe. You also live in the modern universe with COVID. You live in the modern universe with AIDS and cancer and mental health. you will have the same illnesses and injuries as your neighbor who belongs to a different caste, creed, or culture or religion. There's no such thing as a Muslim space. We live in a global village today. Diseases are highly transferable. We all live, for the most part, in a post-industrialized complex. And so we're all experiencing mental health. And so, trying to find an Islamic only cure will limit you to actual cures that are proven, tried, and tested from other communities. And from my observation, other communities are not marketing their research and sciences as Christian medicine or Christian psychology or Jewish therapy or Hindu sciences or Buddhist sciences, because frankly, they're not. Scientists and scholars are actually trying to understand God by understanding the universe. And that's kind of what we're recommended to do as well. And we see that in our brief golden age, those first 200 years in the 9th to 10th century, we actually see that the early scholars saw scholarship for the sake of scholarship. They didn't limit it and narrow it to simply the Muslims. And I can get into this later, but eventually we'll see that Muslims do take, an inward look after they get smashed by the Mongols, where they get scared of looking at the rest of the world. And so, if you have real issues, alcohol, drugs, addiction, marital issues, abuse, you probably want to use specific programs recommended by real regulated professionals who see people hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times in this subject, and owe it to yourself to actually get the best type of treatment and not be confused and convinced by this new era of highly innovative Muslim marketers. So, in conclusion, it is my opinion that Islam does not want you to be ignorant. It actually wants you to know the master of the universe. And the only way you can know the master of the universe is by getting to know the universe. And the only way you can get to know the universe is by accepting universal scholarship. And once we can do that, you will appreciate all the science that is out there, because it all leads to God in the end. But the delivery doesn't have to come from a Muslim. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much.